Welcome to a new Unveiling the Artist. Today's introductory presentation will be on Slovene painter Ivana Kobilca. One of the most prominent and celebrated Slovene painters. One of her most significant and celebrated works is called Poletje, or Summer, from 1890. This painting is located at the National Gallery in Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia and where I'm from and I was born. And I lived about 2 blocks from the National Gallery, and my parents, particularly my mother, would often take me to visit the gallery. And one day my grandfather, who was known for his sort of mischievous nature, told me that Kobilca herself has autographed the painting by putting a grasshopper inside. This is funny, or this was supposed to be funny, because Kobilca means a grasshopper. And every time I would go to the gallery, I would always search meticulously for this grasshopper inside the grass, but I could never find it. Of course, only to learn a few years later that my grandfather made up the whole thing. Kobilca was born in Ljubljana, and her primary education began at the Ursuline High School, the Church of the Holy Trinity, the Ursuline Church of the Holy Trinity in Ljubljana. She studied drawing under artist Ida Kuhn and moved to Vienna with her father and began her formal study by copying masterworks at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. One thing to bear in mind is that at this point, women artists, or women who wished to practice art, was still a fairly new and revolutionary notion, and the tradition was established years ago, which almost made it impossible for women to break into this field. So they really had to fight extremely hard to try to gain any sort of recognition, or even to be allowed to practice alongside their male contemporaries, their colleagues. Works for a while in Vienna and then goes on to Munich, where she studies under a celebrated portraitist. Here is an example of a portrait of a woman in a red dress from 1889 by her professor in Munich. Kobilca's first exhibit came in 1888 in Munich and received a lot of attention by both the audiences and the critics. After leaving Munich, she worked briefly in Zagreb and then settled in Paris for a number of years. She even became an honorary member of the National Society of the Artists. Here is an example of Kobilca's work, Girl in a Dark Vest, from 1886. Her work was included at the prestigious and coveted Salon exhibits on 3 different occasions, which is quite an extraordinary achievement. After Paris, she lived and worked in Sarajevo, and then subsequently moved to Berlin. She finally returned to Ljubljana with the onset of First World War, and she remained there until her death in 1926. Here is a self-portrait from 1907. Her visual aesthetic closely followed the artistic idiom of naturalism in a period that was sort of framed by realism. Realism largely asserted itself as a rejection of the period that preceded it and this idea of ideal representation. Courbet famously said he didn't paint angels because he never saw one. So we are talking about things that can be seen, things that can be touched, things that can be experienced, experiences of everyday people, not only nobility or mythological tales and historic painting. A very famous work from the Romantic period was by Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818, or for example Eugene Delacroix and the Death of Sardanapalus from 1827, which is based on a poem by Lord Byron, and juxtaposed against work like The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet from 1849, work which has subsequently been lost. As you can see in this work, this is drastically different from either The Wanderer or the Sardanapalus. It really talks about the everyday individuals, people who are breaking stones to build roads and railroads which they themselves will never be able to ride on because they can't afford a ticket. Also, very poetically, Courbet here gives us the entire span and sort of inability to escape one's position in life. As you can see, the old man and the young boy are basically two spectrums of the same life, the beginning and the end, and the cyclical nature in which people are caught, unable to move further past their post in life. Also, Millet's Gleaners from 1857, which talks about the poorest of the poor that are basically collecting whatever is left after the harvest. Again, juxtaposing the imagery of the poorest of the poor, which do appear very monumental, against the background in which we see rich houses and economic status. Kobilca over included still lifes, portraiture, genre painting, and even history painting, both religious and secular. And here are some of the examples of the still life: the portraiture, the Parisian lady, likarice, or women ironing, which would qualify as a genre painting or scenes of everyday life. Slovenia bowing to Ljubljana from 1903, which would fall in the category of history painting. Kobilca was particularly versed in establishing social contact, which she very successfully translated into intimate portraiture of people from all social strata, from Berlin millionaires to politicians to middle-class socialites to, the very original and rustic characters found in Slovenia. Portrait of an old deserter from 1886, portrait of an Oriental man from 1889. Here's a portrait of her sister Fanny from 1889. Boy in a navy suit, 1892. And a self-portrait from 1895. Ivana Kobilca was among the first women of modern era to succeed in carving legitimacy in exclusively male-dominated profession, something that must have been very difficult. Her work shared common art interests and places of training with other Slovene realists of her generation, people like Juri Šubić, his famous painting Before the Hunt from 1883, Anton Ashbe, Zamorka, 1895, Jožef Petrošek, or Venetian Kitchen, and Ferdo Vesel. Perhaps the most famous is Ivan Grohar and The Sower from 1907.
Blue, right here. Blue. Blue, right here. Up. What's up? Hey, Blue. Say hi. Hey, say welcome.
Welcome. My name is Miha Sarani, and I would...
Let's go again.
My name is Miha Sarani. I'm an artist, an art historian, and an art educator, and a part-time clown. And welcome. So let's get started. Just a little bit about myself. Briefly about myself. Coming to you live from New York City, from North Lake. Okay, well, let's get started. My name is Miha Sarani. I'm an artist, an art historian, an art educator, and a part-time magician. Poof. This is Blue. She will help me in the presentation.